Hi, everyone. My name is Ariel Mayse. I teach in the Religious Studies Department at Stanford, and one of my primary interests is the interface of religion, ecology, and environmental ethics.
Hello there too, I'm Naama Sadan. I'm a visiting student researcher at the University of California, Berkeley. I study the integration of environmental education into schools, into institutions. The question that many of us are thinking about, and I think a lot about, is how do we incorporate environmental ed into the culture? There's so many great resources, but how do we create engagement? How will school actors see environmental ed as something important and communicate it as such? This is a great question that surprisingly, religions might have a good answers to answer. They're asking for thousands of years how to create culture. Much of environmental education is about science, rooted in the findings and modes of thinking of STEM. That's great because this gives us tools of understanding for charting the landscape and for mapping its contours. It gives us understanding of the problems and to a certain degree, how to go about setting them right. Science is an important map for many things. It can tell us about the ppm of atmospheric pollutants that will significantly increase the chances of a serious catastrophic rise in temperatures. It does not give us, though, an ethical framework for thinking about how one ought to go about ameliorating that change. It doesn't necessarily motivate change. The many, many scientific reports about the state of the world do not necessarily change our attitudes, nor can it necessarily break our ways of thinking about the current issues. We need paradigm shifts, alternative ways of understanding our place in the world, new ways to conceive of the social and economical values that drive forward our culture, and perhaps above all, narratives and stories that are connected to actions, that lead our actions, that inspire new modes of behavior. Science is a map. It can answer all of our questions of how to get there. We need a compass to help us navigate where is it that we're going, a relatable goal.
We are not interested in thinking about how environmental education can stretch to include more religious people or to make the findings of climate science less threatening to them, although these things are important. We are rather interested in giving a few examples as to how modes of knowledge, ethical systems, and narratives found in religious communities can become a voice in contemporary environmental education. Religions, even those that are transnational, don't exist in a vacuum. They're emplaced, they're situated, they're embedded within specific geographic and cultural sites. Their ways of life, their rituals, their mythology are deeply connected to those spaces. In that sense, key aspects of religious literatures carry this dimension of their formative heritage, and especially in their origin and creation stories, even as many of them, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam included, become diasporic. Our point here is not that religions are all indigenous and that they're all part of and that they are not part of the problem. They are. But there's a tension in between connecting to a religious tradition that's formed in another time and place and carrying it to a new location. But we think that their literatures can give us a complex language for thinking about how to become indigenous, how to think about the role of sacred narratives in finding our own place in the here and now, and most important, perhaps, how to act in accord with that. Religions have for thousands of years been building structures and theologies that create meaning in dialogue with lands, knowing the land, existing in relationship with it, not just for those in the present moment, but also with an orientation and an obligation to future generations. Robin Wall Kimmer, in her now famous book, Braiding Sweetgrass, highlights the importance of connecting traditional and indigenous knowledge together with scientific knowledge. And one of her opening points is to go back to creation stories, to use them as an occasion to rethink our relationship to the land and to the non-human forms of life that surround us.
Science provides us with a map, but we need ethics to navigate across this landscape. Religious traditions provide a rich, relevant resource for developing narratives and action-oriented ethics. How can we think with religious literatures in order to expand theory and improve community engagement? Religion weaves nomos and narrative. It creates systems that hold shared meaning through stories, rituals, and laws. I will go now into one small example, the biblical creation story, to give us a way of thinking with religious literatures to expand theory and engagement. Let's talk briefly about what a creation story looks like and what can it serve for. The biblical creation story includes, in fact, two stories. In one of them, the first human is created in the wild and is asked to be a ruler. In the other, to tilt and tend to a garden. What does it mean to be a ruler? And what does it mean to be a governor? What do I need to know about my home, about my land to do those things? What does it tell me about my place in the world and my potential and my obligations? Coming from the garden is very different than coming from the wild. In both, though, the first human has a role, has an obligation, has a connection to the world he is born into, and a responsibility. We have here such a short time, it's only a bright spot, and the biblical story can be unpacked a whole lifetime. But the main idea we are trying to communicate is going to a creation story is a method of asking, where do we go? Where do we come from? How are we part of this earth? What is my obligation to it? How do we structure our obligation? What archetypes do we give our students to hold to and to keep them going? What stories show us the way?
What can I do? Why does this matter? Once we admit that science doesn't hold all of the answers, despite its explanatory power, despite the map that it gives us, even if it doesn't have those tools to move across it, how can we use these resources to enrich environmental education? We suggest 4 basic takeaways. The first, go to deep wells. Look to indigenous literatures and traditions, to other bodies of wisdom that represent other ways of knowing that have evolved in relationship to the land. Use these to find cracks in our ways of thinking, to see our assumptions about the world and our relationship to it. Look to the legacies of religions with new eyes, not with the assumption that they're either irrelevant or simply part of the problem. Dive deeply into a story of creation. Discuss it, consider it, work with it with a student. Consider its implications for how we relate to the non-human world around us. What educational paradigms might it give rise to? And what kind of ethical attitudes might it, as a work of literature, wish to instill in its readers? The second point, think differently. Lean into what Kyle White has described as the epistemology of coordination, as opposed to the epistemology of crisis. This epistemology of coordination, which is found in many indigenous communities, privileges relationship and obligation and kinship and reciprocity, rather than the will to power found in many attempts to overcome a crisis. This is something that we can model within our own educational environments, seeking to cultivate reciprocity and connection between our students rather than a spirit of competition or domination. But it's also something that we can take to the streets, as it were, by encouraging our educational institutions to partner with other organizations in working toward these environmental goals. 3, myths carry ethical responsibilities in religious and indigenous contexts. These responsibilities are not about enforcement, about doing the right thing just because some regulatory body might get onto your back. What about our obligations to the world around us? and to other people. Being a child in the garden that Naama just talked about is to enjoy its fruits without any thought. To be an adult in that garden is to represent one's place with obligation, understanding that we have a role in the continued flourishing of that place, and that we also possess the tools and the technologies to destroy it. Be willing to go where myth touches your experience in this world. Find those new eyes and act with them. The sacred, according to Judaism, is a realm that cannot be instrumentalized. It can't be used for personal profit gain or extraction. Choose a traditional ritual, something that brings you into the context of the sacred, whether it's religious or indigenous, and consider with your students, how might this practice, this obligation, reflect and engender a sense of connectivity and reverence? What values does it reflect? And how are those different from those that govern our contemporary culture? Fourth and finally, part of reconnecting to place is creating rituals of noticing for that world around you and cultivating a connection to it. We are from somewhere, but we are also somewhere. And those things are interrelated, where we are coming, where we have come from, and where we are. Robin Wall Kimmerer describes the importance of connecting to not only the names of things in this created world, but also to their songs. In order to hear their resonances, you must observe, think, and notice. Imagine your children and those who come to follow. What kind of world is it that we wish to leave for them? And what kind of world do we wish to foster and share with the non-human forms of life that surround us? Religious traditions have so many technologies of the spirit, rituals that can be drawn upon in order to cultivate these connections. And these practices are founded in those narratives. Together with your students, brainstorm. How do we go about noticing that world around us? This doesn't just happen. What rituals can we develop that draw upon our own narratives such that we come to see ourselves as more deeply linked to that world, and then to act in light of that connection? Thank you very much.